Okay, welcome. I've been promising students a recording on Erving Goffman's Stigma, Notes on and Management of Spoiled Identity. It's a book I'm not currently teaching, but it's one of those books that I frequently find myself recommending to students who find themselves, sort of out of alignment or, sideways to their family or to their faith of their youth or to their communities. Where they're occupying an identity or coming into awareness of an identity that isn't fully accepted by those in their the normals in their life, to use the language that Goffman uses. It's one of those books that students can read on their own, and what's really powerful about it is that students often, if you have a stigmatized identity of some kind, you don't talk about it much, and the way that you adjust to managing sort of awkward interaction with others, or managing the revelation of information about yourself, is something that is that you keep very secret, that you feel shame about. And what Goffman's book does is it sort of walks through a whole variety of positions in contemporary society that have the same kind of shameful difference associated with them. And what you find is that if there's a name to label the behaviors that you're engaging in to managing your identity, and that those behaviors are common enough, to be the subject of a book. So it tends to be a very profound book for a certain type of person at a certain moment in their life. And it often becomes a kind of gateway drug into the field of social theory as a whole. I don't teach it very often because it is it's very experiential. So it talks about the self and about the management of the self. It sort of speaks to individuals more than anything else. And I'm a critical social theorist, so I'm much more interested in large-scale social structures, the structure of particularity in our moment in time, and the way that selves are derivations or distillations or even depositions from a larger society. And this book, though it deals, again, a lot with the experience of managing discrimination in everyday life and managing, a problematic identity in everyday life, it just falls short of some of those larger scale structural concerns. Now, I'm not the first person to make that assessment of Goffman, and so what I'd like to do as we walk through the book, I'd like to end it by looking at extensions of the concept of stigma made by some sociologists prior to Goffman, some sociologists who were contemporary to Goffman, and then to several sociologists who are writing right now, and who are using Goffman's stigma concept to point towards moments of destigmatization, or to use Axel Honneth's term, moments of moral recognition and acceptance in the larger society, and especially in reference to problems of race and identity. So as we end this recording, we're going to end it on kind of a large scale. So I have handwritten notes, and I'll probably use these. They're just easier to read. At least I'll make sure that they're on the screen. So these notes include, page numbers of key passages, so you can tell where these concepts come from. So, but I need my handwritten note, I think. Okay, so Goffman's stigma then refers to a special form of discrepancy between what he calls a virtual and an actual social identity. And I think my drawing here actually works better. So he distinguishes between stigmatized or spoiled social identities and normals. And so normals are people who are occupying categorical positions or roles or statuses in a society, and who have attributes that, again, are kind of normally associated with that category. And so you have a kind, again, you're in a category and you have the attributes that would normally be associated with the category. And so that's a normal. Stigmatized people have attributes that in some way or other run counter to those typically associated with a category. And so those attributes are seen as troubling, and troubling enough as to fully discredit the stigmatized person from occupying that identity. Okay, so the stigma, again, this refers to attributes associated with a social identity or category. So stigma is an attribute that spoils or downgrades the possessor from full, whole human being to someone who is deeply, extensively, even globally um, uh, discredited. So, this is on page 3. A whole unusual person gets downgraded to a tainted, discounted one, right? So it isn't just that that the person is recognized to have a difference, but that difference is seen to be a kind of global disqualification to acceptance in polite society or to rightful occupation of prestigious or honorific positions in society. All right. So it's an attribute that is deeply discrediting. It shouldn't be seen. It's a language of relationships here. Um, so yeah. Um, so you're viewed then as a tainted person. So again, you're kind of bankrupt in the eyes of society. It isn't just that you can't pay this one social bill, but that you really aren't an adequate person to pay virtually any bill at all. Okay, so again, it's a marker of difference that disqualifies the possessor in a kind of global way. There's an excess quality to stigma. There's a kind of almost a nuclear quality to stigma. It goes everywhere and infects every aspect of one's life and of one's social being. All right, so on page 4, Goffman distinguishes between the discredited and the discreditable. So the discredited are stigmatized individuals who are obviously and visually identifiable, or at least are personally known as possessors of attributes that are disqualifying. So discredited people, he claims, have to manage what he calls uneasy encounters. They suffer, he says, from uneasy interaction. They have often negative self-feeling that is generated during encounters. So that's people who are visually or personally known to possess a stigmatized attribute. And they're to be distinguished from what he calls the discreditable. These are people who can, in one way or another, he keeps writing about passing as a normal. It isn't obvious, the difference, right? And so these people aren't really managing uneasy encounters, they're managing information. So information control, information management are essential. If you're discreditable, you're often trying to prevent the leaking of what he calls stigma symbols or fugitive signs that one is a possessor of that particular stigma. And then you engage in all kinds of other actions to cover and hide the fact. So you have two different types of people and two different types of social problems. The problem of managing the awkward encounters between a normal and a discredited stigmatized person, and then the stigmatized person's difficulty of managing information about this secret shame. Okay. There are 3 types of stigma that Goffman writes about: physical, character, and social stigmas. Let's see here. And all of them, regardless of their origin, are all social. So you have a group of people who are adherents of a particular society, particular moral order. The stigmatized person is a person that has, again, a marker of difference, but the meaning of that difference is something that is derived from society itself. So again, it is an attribute of society as much as it's a marker of individual difference. It is the group, it's the society that creates the category and the attributes of stigma. It's not the individual. Okay? So the normal, so the stigma then is a social construction, a determination of a society of normals. It's created by society, not by It isn't even really created by the normals themselves. It's something that, again, it's a social fact that pre-exists any particular group of normals. So the boundary separating the normal and the stigmatized is what he is really writing about here. So what's important, he says, that most people that are stigmatized can view their stigma from the position of the normals. So a stigmatized person generally understands why they're stigmatized. They generally understand the way that society views them, and therefore they are generally managing something on the order of self-shame. Okay, I think that covers this. Yeah, there's additional points here, but we'll just leave it. Okay, so then he writes about the consequences of stigma. Yeah, so again, there are two that really matter. Again, the anxious, unanchored interaction is one, again, when it's a known problem. So as he says, negative, anxious, unanchored interaction occurs in situations that teeter on the brink of what in other books he calls negative experience. A negative experience occurs when people who are co-present lose the definition of the situation, when they no longer can comprehend what is going on here in social terms, and people who are sort of normally defined by counterparts in a social drama lose the drama and then become sort of unknowing, ambiguous adversaries to each other. So negative experience is a very problematic moment that in general people avoid. Well, stigmatized individuals, when they're interacting with normals, are living in a perpetual sort of state of they're always on the brink of negative experience, of having encounters fall apart. And so, therefore, stigmatized individuals and normals will often seek to avoid encountering each other, leading the stigmatized to self-isolate and leading normals to avoid them, right? Social exclusion. And then there's always that uncertainty of categorical attribution from others. You feel highly self-conscious due to looping, because if you do, you know at any given moment that the others around you are responding not just to the person in front of them, but to the knowledge of the stigma, which means that the work that's attempting to be done in the moment, or the communication that's attempting to be conveyed in the moment, is often lost as the problem of the stigma comes to consciousness, right? So again, it's very difficult to get work done in these situations of normals and stigmatized people coming together, because the stigma looms large, right? Okay, and so that leaves the discredited feeling naked and vulnerable, leading to defensive cowering. These are all pages, or compensatory bravado as a way of coping. So the discredited or the discreditable must cope with an intense surplus of meta-anxiety, that's my term, to which normals are immune. So he writes on page 18 about an infinite regress of mutual role-taking that become, and a mutual recognition that can become debilitating for someone with the stigma, or even to someone who's normal interacting with this stigma and stigmatized individual in an awkward way. So attention then is withdrawn from the expected situational definition. The self and and other consciousness generates uneasy pathological interaction, or what again, negative experience. So the burden of managing this unease, he claims, unfortunately, is borne by the stigmatized. Normals can always just socially exclude, so if the stigmatized individual wants to be a part of a society of normals, they must bear the burden of managing the unease of interaction. Okay, so page 19, what are we going on from there? Yeah, so the other people that the stigmatized individual engages with, there's two major types. You have the normal, of course, and they tend to be relatively unsympathetic towards the stigmatized person. But then there's two other categories of others. One is the own, which is other people who possess the same stigma as the ego, and they tend to be very sympathetic to a fellow sufferer. The second category is the wise. Now, these are otherwise normal people who are in social relationship through family, through friendship, through affiliation in some way, are sympathetic to the stigmatized self, and are often, again, sympathetic and helpful in all kinds of ways. So they're normals who aid and assist and support the stigmatized person. And one of the most interesting concepts from the book is that Goffman says these people are often granted by normals something called courtesy stigma. Again, the stigma is something that is like, the sacred or the sacred and pure, the profane, excuse me, the sacred and pure, and it has a contagious quality. So it rubs off from the stigmatized individual to those who are wise and supportive of them. Okay, so there's a moral career that he writes about as stigmatized individuals, where you go to view yourself as normal and a fully qualified, creditable person, to becoming aware of oneself as the stigmatized individual for whom normals withhold full selfhood. And so then there's differences between those who possess an inborn stigma, and he claims that people who have an inborn stigma are often unaware of the full consequence of possessing it because they're shielded by the wise around them in early days. And then at some point, they wind up with the insulation or the shield removed, facing brutal discrimination without protection. So it tends to be a very sharp moment. Yeah, and then he said one of the big problems of those who have late onset stigma is that you've already fully incorporated the viewpoint of normals toward your stigmatized identity, and therefore you tend to suffer from a significant amount of self-degradation or self-loathing even, right? And that means that one reverses the category of people that one can view as your own from other normals. You realize that's not its other stigmatized people. So again, a kind of a brutal moment of recognition. Okay, so if there are crises then that are generated when one changes social or geographic locations, these are moments when stigma and stigma categories and stigmatization tends to loom large. And one finds often stigma mentors among other people who are suffering, again, in the same way that you are. And then you engage in all these kind of unstable, shifting attachment, ambiguous attachments to normals, to wise, as one moves through this moral career. So it's a difficult thing to manage. All right, anything else here? So again, I'll just kind of lay this up here. So you, again, if you want to freeze it, there's the page numbers of all that we just talked about. Okay. All right. But again, I think this is a powerful section. And again, what I argue is that missing throughout his discussion is awareness of the political dimension of social identities and attributes. These things are, after all, generated and embedded within capitalism and other structures of domination. Authoritarian politics often directs a surplus of power and degradation as stigmatized categories, and that isn't dealt with here, at least not yet. Okay, then he goes on into chapter 2, and this is all about primarily people who are discreditable, that they are not known yet by normals. They're passing in some way as normal, rather than the discredited who can't pass. And so these are people who have information management difficulties. So page 42, again, passing is described. Page 43, it's all about managing information. You're often aware of culturally recognized signs or signals of stigmatized status. You learn these things because you grew up in a culture where the standpoint of normals is widely known. Stigma symbols are like the opposite of prestige symbols. So signifiers of high class or high status, these are often opposite of that. And then stigmatized people often seek out what he calls disidentifiers or signs of normalcy to attempt to cover or to mask the existence of the stigma, again, if you're going to try to pass. There are also less culturally recognized what he calls fugitive signs that can leak through both what he calls, prestige points or slips in the case of a stigmatized individual. But anyway, managing all of these inadvertent displays can become quite anxiety-provoking and again, energy-consuming for those who have a stigma. And this is something that normals don't have to do, right? So normals can just go through life, do work, be in situations. Stigmatized individuals are constantly having to give psychic attention to managing the information and the difficulty of being in these situations. So stigma signs vary in their visibility, their know-aboutness, he calls it their obtrusiveness, their perceived focus, the degree to which it is the center of one's identity, the center of situational action. And then they differ in their ability for the audience to find out about them, suss them out, decode them, and so on. And that it has all kinds of consequences for passive information management. Yeah, he distinguishes between personal identity attached to like a name or an like a little ID card versus one's social identity. And he's really going on here about personal identity more than anything. He talks about biography, the distinction between being around knowing and unknowing others. Biographical others are people who know one, differences in different social environments, cities versus smaller places where one is widely known, and that these generate all kinds of problems for those who attempt to pass. Social space. There's on page 86 the discussion of when a person who is discreditable releases that information to others. Most people can be kept at a distance where you don't have to share, but when people become intimate in one way, friends, close colleagues, lovers, perhaps family members, that there are moments when one has to reveal that one has been masking an identity or covering an identity or presenting oneself as though one didn't have a stigma, and then you do it. And then, like he argues, there's never a right time. If you do it too early, people will exclude and abandon. If you do it too late, people will feel that you've kind of betrayed them or misrepresented yourself in some way. It's hard to be honest and fully open if you're someone that has a stigmatized identity. So how does the stigmatized person attempt to control information about personal social identity? That's talked about in the concept of covering is here too. So yeah, see if we can do this. So this chapter constitutes more than half of the book. So it's clearly something that he worries about and cares about. But as Abdi Kusow writes about in an article that we're going to talk about in just a moment, that means that this book is more focused upon like sort of the white middle class almost more than it is people with much more visible markers of class difference or racial difference. So it really kind of indicates where his concern lay, that half of the text leaves out people with obvious discredited identities to focus instead on the problem of those who can pass as normal, right? Something that that many people with with visible markers of difference can't do. All right. Yeah, so maybe the most interesting section of this, I have it laid out. It's very hard for you to read, but the techniques of information control are towards the end of that chapter. Again, you could conceal or cover the information about. Conceal is really just keeping it from being known altogether. The signs of your stigma, the information about it. You can engage in network disruption or network avoidance, or even go all the way to audience segregation to keep people who know away from people who don't know. You can cover the existence of a stigma with a less stigmatized set of attribute, right? You can attribute the cause to something that's less stigmatizing. You can rely upon own and wise people to help cover for you, or you can engage in voluntary disclosure of various kinds. And then again, he especially emphasizes the concept of covering, where if you can't pass, right? If you can't pass as normal, you make efforts to cover, which he said simply, where you try to downgrade the centrality and the significance of the stigma, both especially in interaction, right? You try to find some way to make it less visible. Apparently, Bob Dole, who was partially physically disabled, he was the man who ran for president in 1996, had a hand that was disabled, and he would cover by carrying a pen in that hand at most times. So that just sort of masked, again, the movement, the lack of movement. Okay. Chapter 3 then goes on to group alignment and ego identity. Now, to me, this is one of the most interesting chapters. So let's kind of walk through that in more detail. I'm going to use my handwritten notes because I can make more sense of it. So group alignment and ego identity. So ego identity refers to sort of the existential self from presentation of self in everyday life, the felt identity, one's self-judgment, self-assessment, self-esteem even. And then the ego identity isn't just towards oneself; it's also towards one's own other people who have your attributes. And so this is, people with a stigmatized identity are likely to have an ambivalence about their identity because they tend to possess the standpoint of the normals, judging the stigma, as well as the standpoint of the stigma, who knows the difficulties of managing it in the face of normal. So they possess both. So they tend to be ambivalent about it. All right, he talks about the difficulties of professionals who tend to be both the own and the wise, who help improve the self-esteem, the social acceptance, the recognition, try to destigmatize the person with the stigmatized identity. He talks about some of the problematic ways that this is done and some of the kind of advice that's given towards self-presentation to avoid minstrelization, sort of making a comic display of the stereotyped attributes of the category. And then to resist what he calls normification or deminstralization, where one attempts to simply deny that there's any difference at all to the stigmatized identity, and instead, he talks about again all these sort of these ideologues or professional activists that are attempting to help people again kind of accept the difference as something that again that can still lead to moral worth and that kind of thing. More on that later about destigmatization. Okay, I'm going to leave some of this out, I think. No more. So he claims that in-group alignments, that the ego aligns with others in the group, advocating for an elimination of stigma from the attributes or the differentness that the person has or the group has. And then out-group alignments, often, how can I put this? Here he's not really talking about advocates for, say, a person with a disability or a stigmatized identity who try to change the viewpoint of the normals towards that group. Instead, this discussion is more about the difficulties that normals face when in interaction with people with stigmatized identities. And then it's all about, again, a kind of like a development of an ideology of sympathy towards normals. That stigmatized individuals are often encouraged to be sympathetic towards normals, to step in and to take responsibility for their unease, to protect normals in some way from feeling awkward in the face of a stigmatized identity. Okay, page 123 is an interesting section on the politics of identity, and maybe that would be a good place to go with this. I'm going to leave it out. So it really is, it's his discussion of again, the efforts to change and alter the meaning of the categories that are involved in this. So when we talk about identity politics today, it's become a kind of what's the right word? A stigmatized phrase among the political right. But, at some point, those who are in stigmatized categories, people of color, marginalized groups, gay, LGBTQ, plus people, people who are migrants, the poor, the homeless, these groups at some point, engage in a political struggle to have the meaning of the attribute change, or the meaning of the category change, and that's identity politics as such. Okay. All right. So chapter 4, the self and its other. This is a weird chapter, but let's just sort of hit it. His argument is, he's got this famous passage on page 128 where he identifies the full unblushing normal. Okay. So there it is, page 128. So he says, okay, in important sense, there is only one complete unblushing male in America, a young, married, white, urban, northern, heterosexual, Protestant father of college education who's fully employed, of good complexion, weight, and height, and with a recent record in sports. Every American male tends to look out upon the world from this perspective. And this constitutes one sense in which we can speak of a common value system in America. And so his claim is that this person, Homo normalis, hardly exists. And you can see that even if a person fleetingly occupies all of the attributes of the unblushing American male of the 1950s, they can't occupy it as young children, and they're not going to occupy it throughout life. So I'm 56 years old, and my time of being a young male has long since passed. So the point is that every person is going to go through the downfall of age, or the problems of being young, and so his argument is then, this is that, to me it's very controversial almost, but this concept of the normal deviant, page 130. So now that we know who the unblushing person is, who's normal, he makes the claim that the stigmatized person is to be called deviant. He might better be called a normal deviant, at least to the extent that his situation is analyzed in the framework presented here. So his argument throughout is that everybody is going to be deviant, and so every person is going to have is either going to be stigmatized at some point or stigmatizable. So on page 128, the unblushing American male is the person who has no shame, and everyone else will have shame, and will have shame at moments. And so stigma management, managing a shameful identity or a shameful difference, then becomes or potentially shameful identities, becomes almost a cultural universal in the modern world. But having said that, he recognizes that there are categories of people that face much larger consequences for having a difference than others. So chapter 5, where he deals with deviations and deviance, these shameful differences again, all individuals will of necessity play both parts of the normal deviant drama. So deviance is widespread. However, he thinks that stigmatization, on page 138, occurs when one is typecast in the deviant category in this drama, so that one is essentially precluded by others from playing the part of the normal. You're typecast as deviant across all domains of life. So you wind up again discredited and essentially barred or excluded or prohibited from being treated by and being accepted as normal. So then again, there's all kinds of consequences of this. Even the stigmatized play normal roles towards those with other stigmas, right? He talks about that. And the meaning of categories of identity, stigma, can be altered over time with historical change and social movement action. I'm going to, we'll get to it later, but just, the historic change in attitudes towards LGBTQ plus people, the immense outpouring of acceptance and, again, destigmatization of members of the trans community, alterations in meaning of people who have Jewish identity, or the transformation of Irish people from being a deeply stigmatized category in the 19th century to now, alterations in the meaning of being Black, of being Latinx, of being really of all of these categories, that these things are historically contingent, and social movement actors and simply the changes of history can alter these things. Okay, so page 141 then, deviance. That the problem of deviance then in its relation to normality is a universal, yet some roles stand out. And so he's writing about this. We could talk about this as a universal problem, but there are several things that are really kind of crucial. He claims that eminent, high status people and people who are recognized as sick are often granted eccentricity credits or a license to deviate without being labeled as deviant. So if you're a very high status, you can engage in open deviance without getting stigmatized by it. But he talks about on page 141 an in-group deviant, that this is someone who has a clear mark of normally stigmatizing difference, but who is nevertheless accepted what he calls a kind of intense, ambiguous inclusiveness within the group, and plays a kind of role of a group mascot, a kind of a class clown, a village idiot, a small town drunk. He calls the fraternity fat boy as another category of this. So this is so groups often will accept one and only one in-group deviant, a person who would normally be excluded and stigmatized, who remains in the group if for no other reason than to define the core of normalcy through comparison. And that's to distinguish from the group isolate, who's a person with a stigmatized identity that is treated as alien, with great levels of social distance, treated as a non-person, isn't defended against outside threats and attacks, and so on. And then there are people who are social deviants, who join, subcultures or communities of difference, and almost embrace a lifestyle within that subculture. And then it isn't until he gets to page 145 and 6, the last couple of pages of the book, where he writes about racial, minorities or racial markers of racial difference, religious difference, other minority statuses, lower class, the markers of poverty and lower class, homelessness, and so on. That is simply where you're stigmatized by mere membership in this broad category that is created by society, sustained by society, and so on. So it's a very important book. And so again, like I've had students who are dealing with families that won't accept them for a variety of reasons, or communities that where they're experiencing stigmatization, who find a lot of personal value in reading Goffman's work. However, to me, the book, again, to a far greater degree than necessary, focuses in upon a person managing a kind of marker of difference in the real. So, he writes about people who have colostomy bags, people who are missing a nose, people who are missing another limb, who have a real difference that isn't socially defined. I mean, the meaning of the difference is socially defined, but the stigma seems to have a kind of reality status apart from the social definition. And I think that underplays then the degree to which stigma is structural, that it results from the structure of particularization within a given society. It is a result of group dynamics, and that stigma is a shameful difference that results as groups come together in normalcy. So in Emile Durkheim's, I had it here somewhere, there it is. In Emile Durkheim's Rules of Sociological Method, there's that famous passage on page 100 where he talks about how you cannot have a society without crime. That crime, though normally defined as a social bad, is essential to the functioning of society. And he writes that if you imagine a community of saints in an exemplary and perfect monastery, in it crime as such will be unknown, but faults that appear venial or minor to us, to the ordinary person, will arouse the same scandal as does normal crime in ordinary conscience. If therefore the community has the power to judge and punish, it will term such minor acts criminal and deal with them as such. So, crime is, again, not an innate bad or evil that one person does. A criminal isn't someone who's innately bad. Crime is a necessary feature of any society worth the definition, and therefore the criminal is going to be a necessary construct of that society. This is this basic social ontology, social realism, that Durkheim is so good at discussing. So if you don't have a criminal in your midst, you'll create one, right? That's the basic argument here, right? Okay, so maybe the scholar or intellectual who's probably most known for articulating this is Jean-Paul Sartre. In his 1944 mini book or long essay, Anti-Semite and Jew, he writes about he says that if Jews didn't exist, anti-Semites would create them. That Jewishness as such isn't in an actual immanent quality of Jewish people. It is a projection of anti-Semitic people onto those that are labeled as Jew. So, the way that he puts it is, it is, I don't want to get into this too much here, but the Jew only serves as a pretext. In other situations, the counterpart will make use of being a black person or an Asian person. The existence of the Jew merely permits the anti-Semite to stifle his anxieties at their inception by persuading himself that his place in the world has been marked out in advance, that it awaits him, and that tradition gives him the right to occupy it. So anti-Semitic people are afraid of losing their place in the social structure to others, and in the same way that that Charlottesville, Virginia, saw that Unite the Right rally a few years ago, where the pro-Trump supporting protesters were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." I mean, that's the essential worry. I'm afraid of losing my place in the world, which I believe is mine by right, and I have to essentially create a mark of otherness to exclude other people from that place, to give me something like self-certainty or psychic certainty that I deserve the place that I have. So he said, Christians create the Jews rather than being a marker of innate difference. We know that the contemporary Jew is, we must ask the Christian conscience. To know what the contemporary Jew is, we must ask the Christian conscience. And we must ask not what is a Jew, but what have you, the Christian anti-Semite, made of the Jews? The Jew is one whom other men consider a Jew. That is the simple truth. It's as simple as that. In a society that lacks criminals, they're going to make them. If you lack crime, you're going to create it. If you lack, if you're an anti-Semitic society, you have to create something. Someone is going to be in the category of the other. So anti-Semitism is the expression of a primitive society that, though secret and diffuse, remains latent in the legal collectivity. Yeah, it's the anti-Semite who makes the Jew. I could go on like this, right? About the attacks and so on. That you find yourself marked as Jew. The Jewish way of speaking, you don't think you've got it. When people you say, well, what is the Jewish way of speaking? It's described, you don't recognize yourself in it, but millions of people, anti-Semites, nevertheless claim that that's what it is to be Jewish. So you assume, he says, a phantom personality, at once strange and familiar, that haunts a person in which you see nothing. That haunts him, in which is nothing but himself as others see him. So you become a screen for the projection of the anti-Semite. Whatever innate qualities are possessed by a Jewish person, those qualities are effaced under the beaming power of the anti-Semitic gaze, right? So in the same way that if you shine a bright enough light on someone's face, you can literally efface them, and they can become a screen for the projection from the projector. Each of us has a character familiar to those close to us, which we ourselves do not see, no doubt. But the Jew has a personality like the rest of us, and on top of that, he's Jewish, and which means that is what is going to matter, and the rest of the self goes away. So it's a stigmatizing identity. Okay, so that's Jean Paul Sartre. So that is this essential Durkheimian point, that is, society needs to have deviance, needs to have difference, needs to have excluded outsiders, and that if those don't emerge, they're going to exist. And that means that those who find themselves in the category of the stigmatized are living in a world that requires someone, some category, something to occupy this stigmatizing place, to push against and from which the normals define themselves, right? All right. So it's group dynamics that really matter. So I think one of the best articles in sociological history to describe the group dynamics that generate and create a stigmatized identity is Edwin Lemert's Paranoia and the Dynamics of Exclusion. And this is a very interesting piece. I won't go into it in great detail, but what he argues is that the symptoms of paranoia right? The suspicion that there's a secret conspiracy where someone's out to get you, right? Where you're being excluded, where other people are treating you in an unreal fashion, those kinds of things. That those who study paranoid people often claim that they have created a pseudo community of others, a pseudo community that they imagine to be conspiring to persecute them, and so on. In other words, it is the innate mental illness of a paranoid person, a stigmatized person, that generates the appearance of the stigmatizing conspiratorial group. And what he finds is it's actually the opposite, that there are paranoid communities or paranoid groups that have possibly engaged in previous battles of some kind, where they have conspired against an individual or conspired against someone that they have labeled as a problematic outsider, and that then attempts to create and behave in a way that is completely congruent with the paranoid person's notion of how a paranoid community would act. So it's that old line, right? That just because they really are out to get you, you may be paranoid, but they really are out to get you, right? Something like that. So yeah, and so really, what Lemert finds is that what generally happens is that there are formal groups that have an informal supplement, right? And that the dynamics of exclusion generally operate in the informal sphere, the place where stigmatization and discrimination can occur. And so the person who feels themselves in a situation where they are being excluded from the formal group functioning and from the informal group function where they're being excluded, they really has little power to alter the informal group processes, and so they instead rely very heavily upon the formality of procedures, which threatens the informal power structure of the group, and therefore the informal power structure of the group will double down in a conspiratorial way to remove or to contain the stigmatized individual, right? So that's what this article is about, that exclusion and all other group activities are informal, and that the stigmatized individual often relies upon the formal procedures, and the more that is done, the more it triggers a paranoid reaction on the part of a paranoid group that will then increasingly seek to exclude or to engage in spurious, unreal interaction, and so on. Lemert on page this is from 1963, but and I don't have that. Yeah, page 13 writes about how that group efforts to remove a member that's threatening the informal power structure will go to incredible lengths of spying on the person, right? And hiring people to keep tabs on them, and so on. So at any rate, it's very interesting. But the point of it is that me mentioning this is that stigmatized identity is a result of a group processes, and I will leave it there. Okay, so so stigma then is a result of group processes of paranoid exclusion, that it isn't something that's innate to an individual who carries that marker of difference, but is instead a deposition of the group itself, right? Okay, and I think that's it. Again, it's the informal, formal distinction that really matters here. All right. The next point then is that stigma results from structural context that can be challenged and reversed. So this is, I think, best written about in an article by Abdi Kusow, one of my colleagues who studied Somali immigrants to Canada, and what he found was that Somali, that the particularization and the markers of difference in Somali were purely cultural, that there were no racial or visible distinctions of difference, that groups that were stigmatized, for example, were simply members of a different clan, and that again that they're purely cultural. So this is on page 186. Yeah, so it's purely cultural differences. There's no way that an outcast clan member can be physically identified relative to others. So yeah, so a stigmatized group cannot be distinguished from a non-stigmatized group, right? Okay, so yeah, so Somali people grow up then in a world, or come from a world, an honor system, or a system of stratification that lacks color-based classification. So then the Somali migrants come to here, Canada, and they enter a world where color is one of the primary bases of difference. So Kusow found that, Abdi found that 17 of his 30 respondents were completely unaware of the color-based identity difference that was dominant in the Anglo-American West, and that 27% were only somewhat aware. Then only 10% of his respondents, 3 of 30, were fully aware that they were about to enter a world in which color was the primary marker of hierarchical difference, right? Where racial categories were really going to matter. One of his respondents said, said, in Canada, we think in terms of black and white. Did you know that? And he said, yeah, right here. Yes, here, I know about it here, but no, this didn't happen in Somalia. I never heard of that word before. I came to this country. Never anything about race. I've never heard of the word, but actually before I came here, this is the time when I heard about it. Okay, so at any rate, so what do you do if you're living in a world where color doesn't matter, and then you go to a different world where it does? So even writes about on page 187 where black people in Canada tended to be identified or misidentified as Jamaican. And so, yeah, so again, so Somali people were mistaken as Jamaicans, which is very interesting too. So, so he writes about the perception that people with this newly stigmatized identity have. There's visible markers, not just from color, but also from wearing a hijab or from other symbols of non-Christian faith, and one of the ways that his respondents dealt with color-based discrimination was to attribute it to something else, especially to the fact of being a migrant who's perhaps or who's Islamic or something like that, to attribute it to something besides race itself. So even though all of his respondents, like none of his respondents, thought that the white Canadians had a positive view of them, so all 30 either thought they had a negative or a neutral or no response at all, they tended to not identify the behavior from normals of stigma to be due to color. They attributed it to other things. So they also preserved a separate system of honor. So when Goffman said that there tends to be just one system of honor, he argues that the Somali migrants maintained their own and then actually rejected the Canadian dominant normal culture. They avoided and maintained distinct, separate cultural institutions, cultural spaces, cultural events, that affirmed and honored the Somali identity, and that again just remained separate from that of the larger Canadian culture. So there was all kinds of avoidance that went on, again rejecting race-based discrimination. And then he ends his piece with something very, very interesting about how the stigma reversal, that his respondents didn't just avoid the stigmatization of the normals in Canada, but actually sought to reverse it. So they engaged in all manner of active interventions, right, where they actively redefined expressions of racism as a signifier of something wrong with the person engaging in the stigmatizing behavior, right? And so they view that I have my own religion, they have their own religion, they have a different idea, I have a different idea, they have a different culture, I have a different culture. The way they think, the way I think, the way they behave, the way I behave, they're totally different, and mine is fine. And so they maintained a strong symbolic boundary between their own group, the Somali migrant community, and that of the overarching Canadian society. Okay, and that's Michele Lamont's idea. So stigma reversal. So the whole idea is that stigmatized groups can engage in um, collective action to alter the meaning of stigmatizing behavior of Goffman's concept of the normal, as well as alter the meaning of the categories themselves for those on the outside. But even apart from that, Kusow's article does such a good job of demonstrating how the categories and the attributes that are stigmatizing and normal are socially, not individually constructed. In that that when you move from one social location and even geographic location to another, you can trigger a kind of a crisis of stigma and struggles over stigma. Okay, very quickly, there is one of the things I think is most missing in Goffman is a recognition that it is capitalism as the dominant structuring principle of modernity, and that any category that's stigmatized is something that is going to be implicated in the accumulation process of capital. So again, I'm not the only person to see this. And so if you look at Michele Lamont, who was the president of the American Sociological Association in 2018, she's been writing for years about what she calls recognition gaps. This is using Axel Honneth's category of recognition and struggles for recognition. Movements and movement actors who aren't seeking class inclusion, for example, but instead are seeking a full recognition. So, middle class movements for inclusiveness. Whether it's gender, race, identity, religious identity, sexuality, and so on. Right? Movements of recognition. But as she argues, capitalism has a tendency to create and maintain recognition gaps where some groups receive a very clear and powerful reflection in the mirror of capitalist culture, whereas other groups disappear or are only presented in a stigmatized way. And she thinks that this is one of the main problems of our time. In an article from 2019 in the British Journal of Sociology, she identifies the primary problems of our time in American society as being due to problems of recognition and recognition gaps. And so she basically claims, again, that capitalism, especially neoliberalism, has rewarded upper middle class people. Mostly white people, but really anyone who attains upper middle class status. That these are the people who are valorized in neoliberalism, and especially in America. So, this is a quick graph that demonstrates how Americans are different from British, German, and French people in terms of the percentage who believes in meritocracy, that capitalism generates meritocracy. Somewhere between 88 and 4% or something like that of Americans will endorse the idea that that who gets ahead in society is decided by hard work, right? And that in America, the number of people, the percentage of people who endorse that statement is increasing with time. It's falling in other countries, at least it did fall, but other countries are much, much lower, 60%, less than 60% in France. So we perceive that the world is quite fair, that those who work hard will get ahead. And so the upper middle class then becomes a kind of cultural idea. So this is the normal, right? This is like Goffman's normal. though in a winner-take-all society. So like so yeah, the upper middle class gets represented much more often in culture, but they're really concerned about maintaining their status. They're really concerned about their children getting into school. They engage in oh yeah, it's really interesting that the wealthier in America, the fewer children you have, and you don't have children because you don't think you can afford them. So I think it's a weird thing that the upper middle class believes it can't afford children while working class people just have them. Yeah. And then this idea that they're so focused on getting each child into elite universities so that they can reproduce upper middle class status that they do not raise children of life, but instead raise children of resumes who can succeed in the application hunt into the best universities. So they become, as she says, excellent sheep. That's a widely used concept in the literature, right? So they become quite perfectionistic. There's all kinds of problems. There's mental health issues there. There's kind of an epidemic of mental health among the upper middle class. Yeah. And then they wind up. She says that upper middle class people in neoliberalism tend to live only around other upper middle class people, so that they're constantly comparing themselves to people who are also quite successful. So even though they have cultural hegemony, they don't feel secure. Okay, so yeah. So in an analysis of the content of television programs, 90% of all characters on sitcoms over 70 years were either upper middle class professionals and managers or working class. I think it's 90% of that 90% were upper middle class and professionals. And of those who appear, working class characters that appear on sitcoms at least, come across as buffoons, incompetent, immature, ignorant, and irresponsible. So when white working class people, or just simply working class people, look into the cultural mirror of television and popular programming, they see reflected back something like buffoonery. Okay, so the upper middle class, even though it is overrepresented in culture and has a kind of hegemony, is quite insecure. Then she says that the bottom half of workers are quite insecure and are actually in a kind of desperate situation. Yeah, they receive very little cultural recognition, and that this is true both for like the white working class people who draw the strongest moral boundaries against black people, against what they imagine to be lazy people who aren't self-reliant or aren't moral. That's their basic identity, is that I'm hardworking, keep the world going, I'm moral, I'm self-reliant, right? And so they set a strong moral boundary against, and then stigmatized people of color and migrants. Okay, and then of course, then there's also the problem then of minorities and of all kinds, and the problems of recognition there. So yeah, so then she writes about what she would like to see are movements of destigmatization and efforts to alter the meaning of categories and groups. So again, I won't go into a lot of detail. I'm running out of time, but her basic argument is that the categories of stigma are linked to capitalism. As capitalism shifted into neoliberalism, it tended to valorize the upper middle class, who now feels under incredible pressure to maintain the privilege and status, and so isn't very happy anyway. And then the bottom half of people who are either the white working class or people who are living as migrants or as a stigmatized minority in one way or another, again, are facing immense problems of recognition. So she's seeking to alter that. So very interesting work. Okay, and I find that interesting. So it's like an application of Axel Honneth's work to sort of like a research and policy agenda to destigmatize the stigmatized. All right. However, I think I want to talk very briefly about a piece that I think challenges the concept of stigma most completely, and that's Royster wrote a book called "Race and the Invisible Hand: How White Networks Exclude Black Men from Blue Collar Jobs." there's a shorter, updated version of Royster's work published in 2007, and it's called "What Happens to Potential Discouraged Masculinity Norms: The Contrasting Institutional Labor Experiences of Less Affluent Black and White Men." Really interesting study. Royster uh, interviewed students in a kind of vocational high school, and even an equal number of white and black students went to their home, talked to their advisors and teachers, and so on. They were in identical in terms of test scores. However, the formal training that the boys received, white and black, should have prepared them equally for admission into the job market. But she found, for a whole variety of reasons, that the informal treatment of the boys in the schools was different from the informal treatment of whites, right? That blacks were stigmatized more, discriminated against more, that formal rules regarding clothing were differentially applied to white and black, right? Like there's this great line about, a black student who had been disciplined for wearing, inappropriate clothing, whatever that was, pointing out that the white students who weren't disciplined were essentially dressing with satanic T-shirts and things, T-shirts with satanic symbols and so on, and weren't getting in any trouble. So she just tracks, like, even if less affluent black men, boys, get into a vocational high school and do well in the high school, they weren't getting good jobs. And so she was tracing the informal networks and the informal coaching and the informal support that white teachers and white community members were essentially giving to white students that black students didn't get. That even when not overtly stigmatized and discriminated against, there nevertheless was a differential system of honor that valorized whiteness over blackness. And so the formal structure of the school, right, didn't help the black students much at all. That most of the white kids found good paying jobs by informal networks of teachers and other white construction workers and so on. It was the informal networks that led to job skills, job experience, and high paying jobs, and that the black students were essentially informally excluded from it, which meant that they had to rely upon the formal structure of the school and of the placement office and so on, which was ineffective. So it's a lot like Lemert's study, where the real power in the world lies in the informal, not the formal, and that anyone who tries to rely upon the formal, when excluded or blocked from the normal informal, winds up in a disadvantaged position. So she ends her piece with a discussion of sort of that if non-affluent black men are a stigmatized category in the early 21st century, it is a result of what she says kind of like a whole series of failures. So she uses Rosenbaum, who argues that status attainment is like a tournament with multiple rounds, right? A ladder kind of, and that you have to get through the first round and not be eliminated to get to the second round, and not be eliminated in order to get to the third round, and that there are losers who get eliminated, who are then stigmatized by their own elimination, and who don't get access to these later contests. So less affluent black men are often eliminated in the very first round of the tournament of status attainment, and they're eliminated as boys in school. And so she writes about how formal school culture is sharply contrasted to the informal masculinity norms of both white and black boys, but that black boys pay a much higher price for performing masculinity than white boys do. And so black boys tend to get over-surveyed. They tend to be punished. They tend to generate a hyper-stigmatizing disciplinary school record. And only about 55% of black boys graduate with their peers. so even if you get through this first round without getting a hyper stigmatizing disciplinary record, um, you then get to the second round of the tournament, where you try to use something like even vocational educational training, high school, to get ahead. And again, the discrepant experiences in schools where the informal power of the teachers generates career help that is then monopolized for white students and not granted to black students, even if not directly stigmatized with overt discrimination, are nevertheless deprived of these informal contacts. So the formal then has all kinds of structural, it's structurally ineffective. So then, yeah, so even if you made it through that round, it didn't get into hiring due to the informal networks that again that are stigmatizing in part based upon the larger culture of black masculinity, where that again that is stigmatized in American culture. If you do get to the third round, she said the only people young black men who made it to the third round were those who really had families that engaged in something like what Leroux calls concerted cultivation, and really with all kinds of massive expenditure of informal energy to make it possible for a student to get that far. So I didn't do a particularly good job covering it on but it's a extraordinarily powerful account of stigmatization in neoliberal capitalism, where sort of like the labor market and the institutional job market intersects with these informal categories of discrimination, tribal stigmas, to use Goffman's terms. And so stigma and stigma processes, stigma struggles, identity struggles aren't something that is just dealt with by individuals in their own rural, local setting, but are struggles that are structured by and coupled to the large, global network of neoliberal capitalism. And what Royster shows is how boys who attempt to do the right thing and be both men in the informal world as well as be compliant and good students in the formal are nevertheless caught in a structural situation from which it's very difficult to extricate oneself. Okay, so that's Goffman's Stigma, a very good book for many categories of people to talk about the problems of managing a spoiled identity or stigmatized identity. And again, in the 40 years, 50 years since Goffman wrote the book, there's been much work linking the concept up to larger studies of social structure. And with that, I'll let it go.